While the generals were busy planning battles, the philosophers were probably thinking, sure, you can win the war, but can you prove it was morally just? This playful question captures the essence of the tension between the powerful forces in ancient Greece, the military leaders and the philosophers. On the one hand, generals like Pericles, Themistocles, and Leonidas were focused on strategic victories, territorial expansion, and defending the city-state. Their success was measured in conquests and military triumphs. On the other hand, philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle questioned the very nature of war, leadership, and the morality behind these actions. To the philosophers, the mere act of winning a battle wasn't enough. They were concerned with deeper questions. Was the war just? Was the leadership virtuous? And most importantly, did the pursuit of military power align with the broader moral and ethical standards that a well-functioning society should uphold? While the generals sought to control the battlefield, the philosophers sought to control the mind and the soul, advocating for a leadership built on wisdom and virtue rather than brute strength and political ambition. In ancient Greece, the relationship between philosophical thought and military power was often marked by a clash of ideals. Philosophers challenged the generals not just because they disagreed with their strategies, but because they believed that true leadership required a deep understanding of ethics, justice, and the good life, all of which transcended mere military success. This conflict between the thinkers and the warriors was not just about ideas. It shaped the direction of Greek society, influencing its politics, culture, and values. Ancient Greece was a paradoxical land celebrated both for its military prowess and its philosophical innovations. On one side, Greece was home to some of the greatest military minds in history. From the Spartan warriors who embodied discipline and strength to the Athenian generals who led their city to maritime dominance, military power was a cornerstone of Greek identity. The heroism of figures like Achilles and Leonidas became legendary, with their deeds glorified in epic poetry and passed down through the ages. Yet, Greece was also the birthplace of philosophy, a tradition that questioned the very foundations of human existence, morality, and leadership. Figures like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle believed that life's most important questions couldn't be answered on the battlefield. Instead, they required deep reflection, dialogue, and a commitment to seeking the truth. For these thinkers, victory in war was secondary to the pursuit of justice and virtue. While military leaders like Pericles gained glory through their strategic victories, philosophers questioned whether such victories were truly beneficial for the state. For them, power obtained through violence could never be the foundation of a just society. Instead, they sought to convince their fellow citizens and especially their leaders that true greatness came not from military conquest, but from the pursuit of wisdom and the cultivation of virtue. It's as if the philosophers were saying, "Nice battle, general, but how about we talk about the meaning of life over a cup of wine?" At the heart of this tension was a fundamental difference in values. For the generals, life was about strategy, victory, and expansion. They were pragmatists who believed that power was the ultimate measure of success. The Greeks had to defend their city-states from external threats like the Persians and maintain dominance over rival Greek cities. To achieve this, they needed strong leaders who could make tough decisions in the heat of battle, unencumbered by philosophical doubts. For the philosophers, however, power without justice was meaningless. Socrates, for instance, was notorious for questioning the motives of Athens' leaders during the Peloponnesian War. He challenged them to consider whether their actions were guided by virtue or merely by ambition. Plato, his disciple, would later argue that only philosopher-kings, those who understood the true nature of goodness and justice, were fit to rule. This clash of ideals often placed philosophers at odds with the political and military elite. While the generals sought pragmatic solutions to immediate threats, the philosophers advocated for a more principled approach to leadership. In their view, the ends did not justify the means. A successful military campaign meant nothing if it wasn't rooted in ethical conduct and a pursuit of the common good. This ethical dilemma was at the core of the philosophers' criticism of military leadership. Where generals prioritized results, victory in battle, the expansion of territory, and the consolidation of power, philosophers were concerned with the process. They asked uncomfortable questions. Is it right to wage war for glory? Can the use of force ever be truly just? For the philosophers, the moral implications of war could not be ignored. Plato's dialogues, for instance, frequently return to the idea that the best rulers are not those who are most skilled in battle, but those who understand the higher principles of justice and virtue. In his famous work, The Republic, Plato argues that true leaders should be philosophers, individuals who have spent their lives contemplating the nature of justice, truth, and the good life. Only such leaders, he argued, could rule in a way that was genuinely in the best interest of society. Aristotle, too, was critical of military ambition when it was pursued without regard for the greater good. In his work on ethics and politics, he emphasized that virtue was the most important quality in a leader. While military success was important, it had to be accompanied by moral integrity. A general who won battles but acted unjustly was, in Aristotle's view, no leader at all. One of the clearest examples of this tension between philosophers and military leaders can be seen in the life of Socrates. Living during the Peloponnesian War, Socrates was deeply critical of the leadership of Athens, particularly the generals who led the city into a costly and ultimately disastrous conflict with Sparta. He believed that the hubris and ambition of the military elite had led Athens away from its true values and had contributed to its eventual downfall. Socrates' public questioning of Athens' leadership earned him many enemies. In fact, his relentless questioning and criticism of the moral integrity of Athens' leaders ultimately led to his trial and execution. Accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods, Socrates was condemned by a jury of his fellow citizens, many of whom were influenced by the military and political elite. His death was not only a personal tragedy, but also a reflection of the larger conflict between military pragmatism and philosophical idealism. The tension between power and morality continued in the works of Plato and Aristotle, who both argued that true leadership could only be achieved through a commitment to virtue. While the generals focused on achieving victory at any cost, the philosophers warned that a society built on military conquest alone would ultimately collapse under the weight of its own injustice. Socrates might have been the original whistleblower, except in ancient Greece, questioning authority got you a death sentence instead of a documentary. So, why did philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle feel compelled to challenge the generals and leaders of their time? The answer lies in their commitment to truth, justice, and the belief that virtue should guide all actions, both in personal life and in governance. To them, a society led by military conquest and ambition could never be truly just or good. Philosophers believed that they had a moral responsibility to question those in power, to hold them accountable for their actions, and to remind them that the pursuit of truth and wisdom was the highest calling. In a world where war was often seen as the solution to political problems, philosophers offered a counter-narrative, the idea that true greatness came not from conquering others, but from conquering one's own desires, fears, and moral failings. In the end, the generals may have won the battles, but the philosophers ensured that the question of justice remained at the heart of Greek society. Their challenge to military power was not just a critique of war, it was a call for a better, more virtuous society, where wisdom guided leadership and where power was wielded in the service of the greater good. Philosophy and politics. While generals in ancient Greece were focused on strategy and victory, philosophers like Socrates and Plato raised questions about the ethics of leadership and the morality of war. These philosophers believed that a successful society could not be built solely on military power, but needed to be guided by wisdom, justice, and virtue. In their eyes, the military class was necessary, but far from ideal when it came to governing the polis. For philosophers, the true purpose of leadership wasn't just to win wars, it was to create a society that was just and good. They argued that the pursuit of military glory could often lead to corruption and moral decay. This section will explore the philosophical ideas of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and how these ideas clash with the military culture of their time. The life of Socrates represents one of the clearest examples of the tension between philosophers and military leaders in ancient Greece. Living during the height of the Peloponnesian War, Socrates often found himself in conflict with the political and military leaders of Athens, especially as the war dragged on and Athens suffered a series of defeats. Socrates was deeply critical of the ambition and arrogance of Athens' generals and politicians. He believed that many of the city's military leaders were more concerned with personal glory than with the well-being of the city-state. This, he argued, was a fatal flaw in their leadership. Rather than pursuing virtue and justice, they were pursuing power for its own sake, and in doing so, they were leading Athens to ruin. Throughout his life, Socrates questioned the wisdom of military decisions, often engaging in public debates with generals and politicians. He famously challenged their understanding of justice, asking whether their actions were truly in the best interest of the people or merely driven by self-interest. In doing so, Socrates made many enemies among the military elite, who saw his questioning as subversive and dangerous. This tension between Socrates and the leaders of Athens came to a head after the Peloponnesian War, when Athens was weakened and looking for someone to blame. In 399 BCE, Socrates was put on trial for corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods, charges that were largely motivated by his outspoken criticism of the city's leadership. In his apology, Socrates famously defended his actions, arguing that he was serving the city by encouraging its leaders to think critically about their decisions. Despite his defense, he was sentenced to death, a martyr for the cause of philosophical inquiry. Socrates was the ancient equivalent of that friend who always questions your choices at dinner, except in his case. Questioning the generals got him a death sentence instead of an eye roll. The trial of Socrates was not just a personal tragedy, it was a reflection of the broader conflict between philosophy and military power in ancient Greece. At its core, the trial was a response to Socrates' relentless questioning of authority, particularly his criticism of the military leaders who had led Athens into defeat during the Peloponnesian War. At the heart of the accusations against Socrates was his refusal to conform to the political and military culture of Athens. He had openly criticized figures like Alcibiades, the brilliant but controversial general who had switched sides during the war and later returned to Athens in disgrace. Socrates' refusal to support the expansionist ambitions of Athens' generals made him an enemy of the state at a time when Athens was desperately trying to rebuild its power and prestige. During the trial, Socrates famously defended his role as a gadfly figure who stings the state into self-reflection. He argued that Athens needed philosophers to challenge its leaders and hold them accountable for their actions. He insisted that his questioning was not an attack on the state, but rather a service to it, as it encouraged the moral improvement of its leaders. Ultimately, however, the military elite and their allies in the Athenian assembly saw Socrates as a threat. His emphasis on virtue and self-examination clashed with the city's need to project strength and unity in the face of defeat. Socrates was convicted and sentenced to death by drinking hemlock. His execution marked the end of his life, but also the beginning of his legacy as a philosopher who challenged the moral failings of military leadership. Plato, the most famous student of Socrates, carried forward his teacher's legacy of questioning military leadership and advocating for a new kind of rule, one based on philosophical wisdom rather than military might. In his seminal work, The Republic, Plato laid out his vision for a just society where leadership would be entrusted not to generals or politicians, but to philosopher-kings, rulers who possess the knowledge and virtue necessary to govern wisely. In The Republic, Plato critiques the idea that military leaders are best suited to rule. He argues that warriors and generals are often driven by their passions, particularly the desire for glory and victory, which can lead to corruption and injustice. For Plato, the ideal ruler is not a man of action, but a man of thought, someone who has spent years studying the nature of justice, truth, and the good life. Plato's Philosopher-King represents the antithesis of the traditional military hero. Where the general is concerned with winning battles, the Philosopher-King is concerned with the moral and ethical consequences of his actions. Plato believed that only those who had devoted themselves to the pursuit of wisdom could be trusted to make decisions that were truly in the best interest of the polis. This critique of military rule was a direct challenge to the power structure of his time. In Athens, generals held significant political influence, and wars were often seen as the ultimate test of a leader's strength. Plato, however, rejected the idea that military prowess was the mark of a good leader. Instead, he argued that true leadership required a commitment to justice, reason, and the common good. Plato's concept of the Philosopher-King represents the culmination of his critique of military leadership. In his view, the best rulers were not those who excelled in battle, but those who had dedicated their lives to philosophical inquiry. Only through the pursuit of wisdom could a ruler understand the true nature of justice and lead in a way that promoted the well-being of all citizens. In The Republic, Plato famously outlines a tripartite division of society: the producers, farmers, artisans, etc., the warriors, those responsible for defending the state, and the rulers, philosophers who govern the state. While the warrior class is essential for protecting the city, they are not fit to rule because they lack the knowledge and virtue required for governance. For Plato, the Philosopher-King is the only one who can see beyond the illusions of power and wealth. He is not swayed by ambition or the desire for victory, but is instead motivated by the pursuit of truth and the greater good. Plato believed that if a society were to be truly just, it would need to be ruled by those who had mastered the art of self-governance, individuals who had overcome their own passions and could lead with wisdom and clarity. This ideal of the Philosopher-King was a radical departure from the traditional notion of leadership in ancient Greece. In a society that revered its military heroes, Plato's vision of a ruler who was more concerned with contemplation than conquest was a bold challenge to the status quo. The complex relationship between Socrates and Alcibiades, one of Athens' most controversial generals, highlights the tension between philosophical ideals and military ambition. Alcibiades, a brilliant and charismatic leader, was one of Socrates' students, and their relationship became the subject of much speculation in ancient times. While Alcibiades was admired for his military genius and political acumen, he was also known for his recklessness and moral ambiguity. Throughout his life, Alcibiades switched allegiances multiple times, from Athens to Sparta to Persia, always seeking to advance his own interests. Despite his brilliance, Alcibiades was often criticized for his lack of principle and his willingness to betray his city for personal gain. Socrates, on the other hand, represented the opposite of Alcibiades' ambition. He was committed to the pursuit of virtue and the belief that true happiness could only be found through self-discipline and moral integrity. Despite their differences, Socrates maintained a close relationship with Alcibiades, often attempting to guide him toward a life of virtue and away from the destructive pursuit of power. In Plato's Symposium, Alcibiades himself admits that Socrates was the only person who could make him feel ashamed of his actions. Despite his military successes, Alcibiades recognized that he had failed to live up to the moral standards that Socrates had tried to instill in him. The critique of war and military leadership in philosophical dialogues. While the generals of ancient Greece saw war as a necessary and often glorious pursuit, the philosophers approached the subject with deep skepticism, raising critical questions about the ethics of warfare and the true nature of leadership. For thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and later Aristotle, the use of military force was not just a practical matter, it was a moral issue that required careful examination. They believed that how and why wars were fought could determine the virtue or corruption of a society. In this section, we explore how philosophers criticize the ambition of military leaders, the destructive nature of war, and the idea that a leader's value could be measured by his ability to conquer rather than to govern justly. In the view of many Greek philosophers, war was not inherently glorious or just. Socrates and his followers believed that the decision to go to war should always be grounded in the pursuit of justice and the common good, rather than in the desire for power or revenge. To them, war was often the result of unchecked ambition or greed, rather than a necessary or virtuous endeavor. In Plato's dialogues, especially in works like the Republic and the Laws, the moral implications of war are frequently discussed. Plato's characters argue that while war may sometimes be necessary to defend a city-state or preserve peace, it should never be waged for personal glory or expansion. They emphasize that the true virtue of a leader lies in his ability to maintain peace and justice, rather than in his skill at commanding armies. For Plato, the wisdom to decide when and why to go to war was a rare quality, one that could only be cultivated by a philosopher-king or ruler who had mastered the art of ethical decision-making and understood the long-term consequences of violence. The mere act of winning battles did not make a man virtuous. In fact, it often revealed his lack of self-control and moral failings. In Plato's ideal world, generals would need to pass a philosophy test before being allowed to declare war. Sure, you can plan a siege, but can you explain the form of justice first? In Plato's Republic, one of the central discussions is about the role of soldiers in society. Plato introduces the concept of the guardian class, made up of those who are trained to defend the city, but who are also educated in philosophy and ethics. For Plato, it was essential that those who held the power to wage war understood the ethical implications of their actions. The Republic famously argues that soldiers must be more than just skilled in battle, they must also possess a deep understanding of virtue and self-restraint. Plato is wary of the idea that unchecked military ambition can lead to tyranny and corruption, noting that soldiers and generals who pursue personal glory are likely to place their own desires above the needs of the city. Plato suggests that soldiers should be trained in philosophical thought to temper their aggressive tendencies and guide their actions according to the greater good. His vision for the guardian class is one in which self-discipline, justice, and wisdom are just as important as martial skill. In this way, Plato's critique of military leadership emphasizes the need for moral education to ensure that war is only waged for righteous reasons. Aristotle, one of Plato's most famous students, took a slightly different approach in his critique of military leadership. While Aristotle acknowledged that military strength was necessary for the protection of the polis, he also believed that the ambition of generals could often lead to moral corruption. In his work Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle explores the idea of virtue and how it applies to leadership. He argues that a leader must cultivate a balance between courage and temperance, to virtues that are particularly relevant in the context of military command. While courage is necessary for defending the state, temperance ensures that this courage is not transformed into reckless ambition. Aristotle also criticizes leaders who pursue war for war's sake, arguing that true happiness and virtue cannot be found in constant conflict. Instead, he suggests that the greatest leaders are those who seek to establish peace and promote the well-being of their citizens. Aristotle's golden mean, the idea that virtue lies in moderation, applies as much to military leaders as it does to individuals. A good general, according to Aristotle, is one who knows when to restrain his power and avoid unnecessary conflict. This balance between strength and restraint is a recurring theme in Aristotle's work, and it serves as a direct critique of military leaders who prioritize conquest over virtue. Aristotle's belief that moral character was the foundation of good leadership stands in stark contrast to the military culture of the time, which often celebrated victory above all else. Later philosophical schools, such as the Stoics and Cynics, continued this critique of military power, often taking an even more radical stance. For these schools, the desire for power, including military power, was seen as a reflection of human weakness and a failure to understand the true nature of virtue. The Stoics, for example, believed that the path to inner peace and happiness lay in the mastery of one's own emotions and desires. They argued that those who pursued power through war and conquest were enslaved by their own ambitions, unable to achieve the true freedom that came from self-control and moral clarity. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus famously taught that the only true power a person could have was over their own mind and soul, not over other people or lands. Similarly, the Cynics rejected the idea that military victories could lead to happiness or greatness. They believed that the pursuit of simplicity and virtue was far more important than any external achievement. Cynic philosophers, like Diogenes of Sinope, were known for their disdain of worldly power and their preference for a life of austerity and philosophical contemplation. For both the Stoics and Cynics, the pursuit of military glory was seen as a distraction from the true purpose of life, which was to cultivate inner virtue and live in accordance with nature. Their critiques of military power were often direct and scathing, challenging the idea that victory in war could ever lead to true happiness. For many Greek philosophers, the ultimate conclusion was that war should always be a last resort, used only when all other options had been exhausted. They believed that war was inherently destructive and should never be entered into lightly. The decision to go to war required careful consideration of its moral implications and its impact on the well-being of the state. In Plato's Laws, for instance, the character of the Athenian stranger advocates for the idea that war should only be waged for the sake of self-defense or to protect the freedom of the city. The dialogue emphasizes that peace is always preferable and that leaders should seek to resolve conflicts through diplomacy and dialogue whenever possible. Plato's view of war as a necessary evil aligns with a broader philosophical belief that violence and conflict are symptoms of moral failure. Aristotle echoed these sentiments in his work on politics, where he argued that the true goal of any leader should be to create a peaceful and prosperous society. For Aristotle, the measure of a successful leader was not how many battles he won, but how well he ensured the happiness and stability of his citizens. This emphasis on peace and justice over military conquest reflects the broader philosophical tradition in Greece, which sought to elevate the pursuit of virtue over the pursuit of power. For the philosophers, a society that prioritized war above all else was doomed to fall into corruption and decay. Generals versus philosophers in ancient Greece, military leaders and philosophers often occupied opposing ends of the power spectrum. Generals were men of action, charged with defending the polis and expanding its influence through military conquest. They were practical, decisive, and focused on results, victory at all costs. Philosophers, on the other hand, were men of thought, concerned with the ethical implications of power, justice, and leadership. For them, the measure of a leader's success wasn't found in battle, but in their pursuit of virtue and wisdom. This inherent tension between the warrior class and the philosophical elite shaped much of the political and intellectual landscape of ancient Greece. While generals wielded military power, philosophers wielded intellectual authority, often challenging the very foundations of military leadership. In this section, we explore how these tensions played out, examining the key points of conflict between generals and philosophers, and how each side sought to assert its dominance over Greek society. From the general's perspective, the role of a leader was clear: protect the polis, conquer new lands, and ensure the safety and prosperity of the people. Military strategy was the primary tool by which these goals were achieved, and a general's success was measured by his ability to win battles, secure territory, and maintain order. For generals like Themistocles, Pericles, and Leonidas, leadership was about decisive action and pragmatism. In times of war, there was little room for philosophical debates or ethical dilemmas. Decisions needed to be made quickly, and the consequences were often a matter of life and death. Generals were responsible for the defense of their city-state, and their actions had to be driven by the practical needs of survival and victory. In the eyes of many military leaders, the philosophical questioning of their decisions was not just unnecessary, it was dangerous. The very nature of philosophy, with its tendency to challenge authority and question motives, threatened to undermine the unity and discipline required for effective military leadership. To a general, a philosopher who questioned the morality of war in the midst of a battle might as well be questioning whether the war should have been fought in the first place, a luxury the general could not afford. In contrast, philosophers approached leadership from a completely different angle. For them, the ability to lead wasn't just about winning wars, it was about governing justly and pursuing the common good. The moral character of a leader was far more important than his military prowess. If a general won battles but acted unjustly or violated the principles of virtue, his victories were hollow in the eyes of the philosophers. Philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle viewed war and conquest as necessary evils rather than sources of glory. While they acknowledged that military action was sometimes unavoidable, they were deeply concerned with the ethical implications of war. Socrates, for example, was known for questioning the wisdom of Athens' military leaders during the Peloponnesian War, criticizing their decisions for being driven by ambition rather than the greater good. For philosophers, leadership was fundamentally about self-governance, the ability to control one's own desires, emotions, and ambitions in the service of justice and virtue. They argued that a leader who sought power for its own sake was doomed to become a tyrant, whereas a leader who governed with wisdom and self-restraint would bring true harmony and prosperity to the polis. In their eyes, the military class lacked the moral insight needed to rule. While generals might be skilled in the art of war, they were often blind to the ethical consequences of their actions. Philosophers believed that leadership required a broader perspective, one that considered not just the immediate goals of victory, but the long-term impact of war on the soul of the state. The Peloponnesian War for 31 to 400 for BCE, a devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta, serves as one of the clearest examples of the tension between military leaders and philosophers. The war, which dragged on for nearly 3 decades, saw Athens led by generals like Pericles and Alcibiades both of whom embodied the pragmatic, ambitious leadership style that many philosophers distrusted. During the war, Socrates became increasingly vocal in his criticism of Athenian leadership. He questioned the motives behind Athens' military campaigns, arguing that they were often driven by self-interest rather than the pursuit of justice. In particular, he was critical of Athens' decision to invade Sicily, a disastrous campaign that ended in a humiliating defeat and contributed to the eventual downfall of Athens. Socrates' public questioning of the military elite made him deeply unpopular with the political establishment, many of whom were either military leaders themselves or closely aligned with the generals. His refusal to support Athens' military ambitions was seen as an act of disloyalty, and his insistence on prioritizing moral virtue over political success placed him at odds with the city's ruling class. The tension between philosophical idealism and military pragmatism reached a boiling point with the trial and execution of Socrates in 399 BCE. While the official charges against Socrates were impiety and corrupting the youth, many historians believe that his outspoken criticism of Athens' military leadership played a significant role in his downfall. For the military elite, Socrates' questioning of their authority represented a threat to the stability of the state, especially in the wake of Athens' catastrophic defeat in the war. Throughout Greek history, military heroes were often celebrated for their bravery, strength, and victories in battle. Figures like Achilles, Leonidas, and Alexander the Great were held up as exemplars of heroic leadership, and their exploits became the stuff of legend. These men were revered not only for their ability to win battles, but for their willingness to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the polis. However, for philosophers, this kind of heroic leadership was often seen as shallow and dangerous. While they acknowledged the importance of courage and strength, they believed that these qualities were meaningless without a strong foundation in virtue and wisdom. A general who fought bravely but acted unjustly was no hero in the eyes of the philosophers. He was simply a man ruled by his own desires. Plato, in particular, was critical of the idea that military heroes should be the ones to lead society. In the Republic, he argues that while soldiers play an important role in defending the state, they lack the moral insight necessary to govern. For Plato, the true leaders of society should be philosophers, who have devoted their lives to the pursuit of truth and justice. Only a philosopher-king could rule wisely, without being corrupted by the temptations of power or the thirst for glory. This contrast between military heroism and philosophical virtue created a deep divide in Greek society. While the common people often admired the strength and valor of their military leaders, the intellectual elite argued that true greatness came not from victory in war, but from the pursuit of ethical leadership and moral responsibility. Despite the inherent tension between generals and philosophers, there were moments when the two worlds intersected in surprising ways. One of the most famous examples is the relationship between Alexander the Great and his teacher, Aristotle. Although Alexander is remembered primarily as a brilliant military commander, his early education under Aristotle's guidance exposed him to the philosophical ideals of virtue, justice, and self-control. While Alexander's later conquests may have seemed to contradict Aristotle's emphasis on moderation and the golden mean, there are moments in his life where the influence of his philosophical training is evident. Alexander is known to have respected and valued the wisdom of philosophers, and he famously spared the city of Athens out of admiration for its intellectual legacy. Aristotle's teachings on the ethics of leadership likely shaped Alexander's views on rulership, even as he embarked on a campaign of unprecedented military expansion. Although Alexander's ambition often drove him to violent conquests, his philosophical training may have tempered his actions in moments of diplomacy and governance. This intersection of military power, and philosophical thought serves as a reminder that even the most pragmatic of leaders can be influenced by higher ideals. The tension between action and thought may never be fully resolved, but the dialogue between generals and philosophers has left a lasting legacy on the nature of leadership in the Western world. It's like Alexander was the original philosopher warrior conquering cities while pondering the meaning of life. The legacy of the conflict between Greek philosophers and military leaders left an indelible mark not only on ancient Greece, but also on the development of Western thought about leadership, war, and ethical responsibility. The critiques put forth by figures like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle transcended their time, offering a model for future generations to question the relationship between power and morality. While the military heroes of ancient Greece, such as Alexander the Great, left a legacy of conquest and empire building, the philosophers who challenged them left an equally powerful legacy, one rooted in the pursuit of justice, self-restraint, and the common good. Their teachings continue to shape how we think about leadership, from political rulers to military commanders, reminding us that power without virtue can lead to tyranny and corruption. The philosophical critique of military power has endured for over 2 millennia. The ideas that Plato and Aristotle explored in their writings, particularly about the importance of virtue in leadership, remain central to modern discussions of ethics and war. From the just war theory, which evaluates the moral justification for engaging in conflict, to modern debates on the ethical use of force, the legacy of Greek philosophy is clear. Greek philosophers, especially Plato, argued that the pursuit of military glory was often driven by personal ambition rather than a genuine concern for the well-being of the polis. This skepticism of military power has resonated throughout history, influencing leaders who seek to balance the necessity of defense with the moral imperative to avoid unnecessary violence. For many, the lessons of the Peloponnesian War, where unchecked ambition led Athens to ruin, serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of militarism without moral guidance. The ancient Greek notion that wisdom and virtue are essential qualities in a leader continues to inform modern leadership theories. Today, many of the world's most respected leaders, whether in politics, business, or the military, are judged not just by their achievements, but by their character and moral integrity. The Philosopher-King ideal that Plato envisioned may seem distant in a world dominated by political pragmatism, but its underlying principle that true leaders should prioritize the well-being of the whole over personal gain still resonates. Modern leaders are often measured by their ability to make ethical decisions, especially in times of crisis, where the choices they make can have profound effects on their societies. In the military sphere, this is reflected in the emphasis on ethics and leadership training, particularly in democratic nations where justifications for war must align with moral and legal standards. The critique that Greek philosophers leveled against generals who wage war for personal glory continues to influence how military action is discussed and evaluated today. The lessons of Greek philosophy have also had a lasting impact on how modern societies view the role of war. The Stoics, for instance, emphasized self-control and inner peace as the highest virtues, dismissing the pursuit of external power as a distraction from the true goals of life. This perspective has been echoed in modern pacifist movements, which argue that the pursuit of military solutions to political problems often leads to more harm than good. Moreover, the idea that war should be the last resort, a principle advocated by Plato and Aristotle, remains central to international diplomatic efforts today. Organizations like the United Nations are built on the idea that conflicts should be resolved through dialogue and negotiation rather than violence. The philosophical skepticism of war's morality continues to inspire movements toward peaceful conflict resolution in modern times. The ancient Stoics would probably love to see modern peace talks less about who can conquer who, and more about who can maintain their cool in negotiations. The enduring legacy of Greek philosophers lies in their insistence that power should always be tempered by wisdom and virtue. Their arguments that military conquest alone could not bring lasting peace or justice continue to influence the way we view leadership, governance, and the use of force in the modern world. The balance between pragmatism and moral integrity, the tension between philosophy and military power remains as relevant today as it was in ancient Greece. Whether in the halls of government, the boardrooms of corporations, or the command centers of military operations, the lessons of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle remind us that true leadership is not just about making the tough decisions, it's about making the right decisions. In a world where the pressures of power can lead to moral compromise, the philosophical tradition offers a necessary check on the pursuit of ambition and self-interest. Today, the critiques of war and leadership posed by Greek philosophers have found new relevance in discussions of global conflict, military ethics, and governance. As world leaders face complex decisions involving military intervention, economic crises, and social justice, the lessons of ancient Greece remind us to ask the deeper questions. Is this just? Does this serve the greater good? Are we acting with virtue? The interplay between philosophical thought and military strategy continues to shape our understanding of power and responsibility. The tension between doing what is necessary and doing what is right, a tension that haunted the generals and philosophers of ancient Greece, remains one of the most pressing challenges of modern leadership. As we continue to navigate a world where power is often wielded without ethical reflection, the voices of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle serve as a reminder that wisdom and justice must always guide the actions of those who lead. Perhaps the real question isn't why did philosophers challenge the generals, but why aren't we listening to them more often today? Conclusion: the Greek philosophers who challenged the generals of their time laid the groundwork for a tradition of ethical leadership that continues to resonate throughout history. While generals may have won battles, it was the philosophers who won the hearts and minds of future generations. Their emphasis on justice, virtue, and the moral responsibility of leaders has shaped how we view the balance between military power and ethical governance. As we reflect on their legacy, one thing is clear: power without wisdom is dangerous, and leadership without virtue is hollow. The ancient debates between generals and philosophers continue to inform our modern understanding of what it means to lead, and their timeless wisdom serves as a guide for those who seek to rule not just with strength, but with justice and compassion.
By my side, intense, strong, no fear to face, nowhere to hide, intense. I subscribe to this channel, click like today, because content like this just lights my way. Intense and slow.